Welcome to a virtual tour at the Granville Historical Society, located at 115 East Broadway in Granville, Ohio. This video presents an exhibit on Granville High School student Ethan White's experience excavating his backyard during the COVID pandemic. In the spring of 2019, Ethan White was clipping branches along a trail in the woods on his family's property when he saw an iron rod sticking out of the ground. A year later, while going to school remotely during the pandemic, Ethan learned how to professionally excavate to explore what lay beneath the dirt on his family's property. As Ethan excavated, he uncovered local dumping pits dating from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. In all, he found numerous bottles and glass objects, farming and mechanical tools and equipment, shoes, belt buckles, pottery, toys, and metal objects, just to name a few. This video examines Ethan White's experience and process through an interview between him and Cynthia Court, collections manager for the Granville Historical Society. The Ethan White exhibit was on display at the Granville Historical Society from 2022 through 2024. We hope you enjoy this exciting video on Ethan's archaeological experience in Granville, Ohio.
Thank you for joining me today. I'm Cynthia Court, the collections manager of this museum, and I'm here with Ethan White. Welcome to the Cherry Exhibit Room of the Granville Historical Society Museum. Currently on display in this room are the artifacts uncovered by Granville High School senior Ethan White in his family's yard during the COVID pandemic.
I'm Ethan White. Thank you for interviewing me.
Tell me a little bit about yourself and your background.
I am currently a senior at Granville High School. I am involved in a lot of extracurriculars. I spend a lot of time volunteering at the Granville Historical Society. I run cross-country and track, and I participate in orchestra and play the electric guitar.
And what motivated you to excavate your yard in the first place?
I was just out clearing the woods. I love nature, so I always like to maintain the trails on our property. And one day I was just sort of trimming some plants, and basically I saw a large iron rod sticking out of the ground. I started digging around it just out of curiosity, initially just because I wanted to sort of remove it from the woods because it wasn't natural, and I unearthed some broken pottery and some glass, and that piqued my curiosity, and from that point I just started to excavate, and as I uncovered more and more stuff it became more formal, and I reached out to experts.
Who taught you how to do this excavation, and what assistance did the Granville Historical Society provide you with?
I reached out to the Ohio History Connection to just get some general advice on cataloging finds, excavating, and keeping track of basically everything while also recognizing dates and the historical importance. I would credit my knowledge of excavation primarily to the Ohio History Connection. Specifically Brad Lepper. From that, it was a while back, but he forwarded me a bunch of materials. One of the more useful things is he actually sent me in an email an entire compilation of an excavation that the Ohio History Connection did and conducted, and that gave me a lot of pointers. It showed them mapping out the area, identifying key features in the landscape, the idea of test pits. The Historical Society was really useful in my much broader research, basically pinpointing dates, the property, who owned the property, if any of the stuff was local, which a lot of it was, identifying sort of the years those companies were in business. A lot of the beer bottles and stuff I found was all local, had the local name stamped on it, and I actually found several examples of those bottles, either in the collections or advertisements. I spent a good chunk of time looking through a lot of the old local newspapers in the archives, and I ultimately found a lot of those same sort of advertisements for those companies that I actually uncovered.
Describe your process for us.
First, I dug essentially test pits to find out where artifacts were located, because it was a significant swath of the woods, and I didn't want to just go tearing up all of the vegetation and trees and stuff. So I did that. I established where stuff was focused and ultimately determined that they had dug 3 sort of rectangular pits. And in those pits, they had deposited the majority of the artifacts. There were some artifacts scattered around the area, but those were not unnaturally deposited there. Those had been washed out from erosion and other such factors. So after I established those 3 pits, I basically started excavating from the top down, pit by pit, and then basically I was careful in how I handled any of the soil coming out of the pit. I didn't want to miss any artifacts or any historical marker of importance of age. So basically I checked it, I spread the soil out, sometimes usually on a tarp, and then I always waved a metal detector over it. Felt that was important. And ultimately I found in those a bunch of stuff that just wouldn't have been found by simply just digging with a shovel.
What can you tell us about the property that this was on?
It served primarily as a community dump. There are multiple households in the area, farms, and essentially whatever they didn't need anymore, whatever they had used until broken, or simply whatever wasn't important enough to keep in the household, they just deposited there. It rests primarily on what was the property, or consisted of the property of the Big Spring Farm, is what it's called, and is marked on several historical maps. And that was owned by the Jones family.
Ah, interesting. One of the Welsh families up in the Welsh Hills.
Yes. From my general knowledge, the dumps were most likely active between 1860 and 1910. A lot of the artifacts on display are from later years, simply because there wasn't as much stuff being thrown out as you go farther and farther back. There's just not as much being manufactured. Stuff is being used until it's broken more often, simply because stuff is harder to get when it's older. I found numerous little glass shards and pottery shards that all indicate that the dump goes a significant time backwards. I found significant evidence in broken glass and pottery that the dump was used starting in the 1860s, but they simply didn't use the same amount of stuff.
Tell us about 2 or 3 artifacts that you uncovered that you thought were really interesting.
One of 2 interesting items I would like to point out that I found. The first one being number 6, the insulator. It was either used for a telegraph or a phone line, and I found it in the first pit I dug towards the beginning of my excavation. And what's interesting about this is, at least in my mind, is it shows sort of technology progressing. A lot of the items I found in this dump are considered more primitive or rural or not as complex, but the fact that I found an insulator shows that there is a working line of communication in the community, which I found really interesting. It wasn't what I would have expected for a rural part of Ohio, presumably around the turn of the century. Item number 16 I've always found interesting is a harmonica, or back in the day, it wouldn't have necessarily been referred to as a harmonica, depending on what age it is. This is hard to pinpoint an exact decade on. It would have maybe just been referred to as a music reed or something like that. But that one I found, it had been washed out, and the 2 halves were actually a good deal distance from each other. And that was found using a metal detector. That was not buried in the pits themselves. That had at some point, probably due to the fact that they're just 2 lightweight copper plates, had been washed out by rainwater. The harmonica is interesting to me just because it demonstrates that the people who lived in this area had hobbies, and aside from just the multitude of different products and glass bottles I found, it shows a more sort of leisurely activity that they were doing.
I have to say that it's very impressive what you've done. We are very pleased with what you've accomplished and what you've learned, because it really shows that young people can do these things. And for the most part, lots of people don't get interested in history until they're older. And so we're excited to see that you're doing this. This is a great project. Thank you.
Thank you.